third membership network conversations event. We started in October and then also had an event in December. And today we welcome Dr. Walter Bruggemann to our conversation for the next hour and a half or so. We're experimenting with different forms of communication on these conversations. So you'll see on your screen a lovely picture of Dr. Bruggemann. And Dr. Bruggemann is in Cincinnati. Our office is in Columbus. And right now we're linking to him via phone. And that's why we were doing specific sound checks, so that you're aware of that. Just as we started this whole series, we were thinking about the ways in which we could create a triangle, as you would in a coaching situation. And now we've got a different kind of triangle, in part because Dr. Bruggemann does not have a camera on his computer, which is great because it's allowed us to actually think about how the dynamics of the conversation work. So thanks, Walter, for allowing us to expand our adaptive capacities here at Healthy Congregations.
Well, I appreciate your flexibility about that. Thank you.
Sure. So I have a series of questions, folks, for everyone, and to direct towards Dr. Bruggemann. And I'd like you to, if you have questions along the way in our conversation, his and mine, to post those in your chat box through your keyboard. And I'll keep an eye on them. I may or may not pass some of them on to Dr. Bruggemann. I'm going to be the sorter, not unlike what a coach does in a small group coaching situation. And I have a series of questions that I'll ask, but I do want to invite conversation as well from all of you. So I want to ask a general conversation of you, Walter, and that is, whatever prompted you to begin to delve more and more into the mysteries, I'll call them, of the Old Testament? I'm someone that the Old Testament classes, even though I did well in them in seminary, I didn't pay good attention. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the prompts for you that led you into Old Testament scholarship.
Well, I grew up in a rural parsonage. My father was a pastor, and I decided, I think in high school, that I was going to go into ministry. So as I did college and went to seminary, when I got to seminary, the most interesting and compelling teachers I had were in Old Testament studies. One of them was what is an amazing storyteller, and the other one had just discovered the work of Gerhard von Rad, and the combination of those set me on course, and my teachers channeled me into graduate study in Old Testament, and the rest is history. But I found from the beginning that the sort of playful, artistic, unsettling quality of the Old Testament text suited me very well, and I have only grown in my engagement with that and become more alert and more attentive. So it really was my seminary teachers that created that possibility for me and set me in that direction.
Now, I assume then that you also served in a parish for a period of time. Is that true, Dr. Bruggemann, or did you move into scholarship pretty early on in your ministry?
I served a church in New York while I was in graduate school for 3 years, but that wasn't quite ministry. And then I went immediately into teaching. I returned to my alma mater and had never fully engaged in pastoral work directly. There is, as you may know, a long-standing critique of that people ought not to teach in seminaries if they hadn't had pastoral experience. But I cheated on that, and I have discovered along the way that I never could have been a pastor I just don't have enough patience to do that. I've observed that the difference is if you're a teacher, if you get people you can't stand, you just graduate them. But you can't graduate people from a parish. So I'm glad that my calling turned out otherwise.
Well, that's very insightful. I'm not sure it's true, the critique of pastoral experience, and that should be in the classroom. That certainly is how I teach out of my experience quite a bit. But some people are more gifted to not have to teach out of their experience, so I'll say that for you. But I also wonder about the impact of having a father who was a pastor, and I'm assuming that may be part of your lineage too. Walter, is that true?
Well, that's certainly true. My father was a huge influence in my life that I continue to discover more and more, and I do think that my nurture in the life of the congregation with him, it wasn't a complete substitute for my own pastoral experience, but it was a big advantage to me, and I come to have more and more regard for his way of being a pastor, and that certainly has been important in my own shaping. Yes.
And one of the things that I do when I do family systems coaching, Walter, is I ask about the presence of ministry in the family dynamic, and also who ordained you, not officially ordained you, but who was the person that in your family said, these are gifts that you have. You clearly had seminary teachers that saw this in you, but did you have anyone in your family that you would say really blessed you to go into the direction of Old Testament scholar or minister or whatever? Was there anyone in your family?
Well, certainly my dad was the decisive influence, and he did in fact ordain me. But he also was a mentor when I was growing up. He was a mentor to many young pastors who were continually going through our home on visits, and I thought that those young pastors were the most impressive people I could imagine, and I sort of wanted to be like them and wanted to be with them. So I had great support of that kind as I was growing up. And then, of course, my seminary teachers in Old Testament. When I went to seminary, I had never heard of graduate school. I didn't know such a thing existed, and they took all of the initiatives in confirming my capacity to do that, which I have always been unsure about even till this day. But they affirmed it, and that was good enough for me. So I never could have gotten along the way without those teachers.
Yeah, that makes me think about the number of ways that either someone who's in any kind of ministry sees something in someone and encourages them to go into ministry or into further study or whatever, that we all play a part in noticing the gifts of other people, including our family members as well.
I think that's right, and I think in my own teaching practice that I have continued that through my MDiv teaching. I have, I think, been to some extent responsible for 15 of my MDiv graduates who went on and got doctorates in Old Testament and are now teaching in good places. So that's sort of my legacy of wanting to be a mentor to help people into the discipline.
Yeah, that must be very gratifying too, to be able to see, the sparks in the next generation. That's that multi-generational stuff that Bowen people talk about too, and it has to do with, as you were using the word capacities too, noticing capacities and encouraging them in students as well. I see that.
That is surely right. I'm also delighted to observe that. For the most part, those people who have gone on have gone well beyond my learning in their own research and learning, and of course that's very satisfying to a teacher as well.
That's great. That's wonderful. Yeah. So as you think now at this stage in your life and your both your family life and your professional life, are there characters or stories or books in the Old Testament that you find the most intriguing now for you that really resonate with you at this point in your life?
Well, I love these texts, and whatever text I'm working on is compelling to me. But I suppose my continual reference point is probably the book of Jeremiah and the person of Jeremiah as he appears in the book. He lived in a very conflicted time and was himself a very conflicted guy who reflected the conflictedness of trying to live with this strange God. And so I continually go back and always tell my students that the book of Jeremiah reads like it was written yesterday. It is so immediately contemporary, and it does bear witness to the stamp of a personality the way in which not many other books of the Old Testament do. So I continue to be preoccupied with him. And as you may know, I've put a great deal of energy into the lament psalms, and the book of Jeremiah offers half a dozen or so lament psalms that were on his lips, but clearly reflect the tradition of the book of Psalms. So that's been an opening wedge for me to be aware that in his time, the honesty of lament was mandatory, as I think it is in our time with the disarray in which we find ourselves.
I just think about that in the contemporary church, Walter, and about what lament demands is being able to confront the reality of the human condition. You know, what it's like to be human, and with all its frailties and all its failings and the things that are going on in society and so on. And I mean, I think the lament of not feeling up to what God is putting before one is kind of the traditional style of Jeremiah, if I can simplify it. But if we do that, if we acknowledge the lament as part of our life, then the capacity to get deeper and broader and be a bigger person is there. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I do, because I've spent a lot of time on it. I think that the church has done two things. First of all, that the church is a cottage industry for denial, in which we want to be a happy, happy, happy place. And the second thing we've done is we've transposed all of our pain into guilt. So the only thing, and there is a study by a Swedish scholar who has studied 50 lament psalms in the book of Psalms and observes that in not one of the 50 laments is there an admission of guilt. So that characteristically, what these laments say is there are big problems and they are not my fault. So it requires a kind of vigorous sense of self to speak that truth in the presence of God without right away saying it's all my fault and I really am filled with deep regret. And the lament psalms do not do that. So I have struggled personally. I have struggled a great deal with the capacity to have that kind of courage in the presence of God to speak the truth, which is filled with pain, for which I am not primarily responsible. And I think that's a standard motif in the lament psalms, as it is in the book of Jeremiah.
I think about that as in some ways really fundamental to the kind of work that those of us in Bowen theory do too, with these kind of biblical resources giving us a glimpse into something deeper too, that the natural tendency for the human being now is to blame, and how to move away from blame into greater courage in dealing with people. I mean, I think about it as a ministry challenge all the time too. It's easy in a parish setting where you have all kinds of stuff going on, how to first focus on how one can work on one's own courage and acknowledge the pain. I actually think, Walter, that people are most afraid of pain today, and so do everything they can to put themselves in a position so they don't experience pain. So that's, you know, the rise of pharmaceutical and issues with other kinds of ways to make the pain go away. So that your call to the church to be courageous, for each one of us to be courageous in our capacity to work on relationship with God without blaming God or taking over responsibility for ourselves. That to me, that to me is
and I think that what we I don't think we mostly expect our pain to be quickly relieved. I think what we want is for our pain to be acknowledged. And the way I formulate that is that pain that is acknowledged turns to energy. Pain that remains unacknowledged turns to violence. And I think that the readiness for violence across our society is rooted exactly in the denial and the inability to have our pain valorized. And I think you can see many, many examples of that.
Yeah, it's very powerful stuff. I'm going to ask for thoughts from our gathered, mostly clergy, ministry leaders here, if there's any thoughts. I notice one comment, Walter, one of the kind of foundational figures in the family systems movement related to congregations is Ed Friedman, and one of our participants said that Ed Friedman said that individual maturity included the ability to tolerate pain in self and in others. Is this denial of which Walter speaks an indicator of a degree of immaturity? That's the
well, I think it is. I think it is. It is a measure of immaturity. It is also, I think, an inability to risk oneself in dialogic transactions. You cannot have pain dealt with well unless it is shared in a relationship. And when we are immature, we do not want to risk that much or expose ourselves that much. And without that kind of risk and without that kind of exposure, there isn't any way to have our pain honored or taken seriously. So what we do is we bottle it up, and I think we come to cherish our pain rather than wanting to relinquish it into a relationship.
I use as an example in class, I teach a lot of practical theology classes, but I talk about the moving towards those relationships that are the most scary. So that I give examples of people in my parish who were very critical and so on about, and I think that this is consistent with what Bowen said about the dynamics are in the in-between between two people or a group of people and other people as well, so that any work that we can do toward the places where we've experienced the pain is really important. For example, one of the disciplines is to go back to our families where there has been lack of what you described as a kind of a dialogue and interaction, that you said dialogic transaction, that kind of getting in the energy of between two people and being brave enough to give it a go, even though it is frightfully scary, especially with the people that we love the most.
That's right, and I have come to the awareness, which I think is correct, that the Old Testament and the Jewish tradition in which it has emerged is really the great sponsor of a dialogic understanding of reality. And the reason that the Old Testament remains so important as a text for the church and the synagogue is that it is from the ground up dialogical, and then you can trace that out in terms of Buber and Levinas and so on. But if you just take one text in Exodus 32 at the drama of the golden calf, Yahweh just gets angry as hell and wants to destroy everybody. And then what happens is that Moses intervenes and talks Yahweh out of killing. And Yahweh says to Moses, "Leave me alone so that I can act out my anger," in which God recognizes that he cannot act out that anger in the presence of Moses. So he wants to banish Moses from his presence. It doesn't seem to me that elementally it gets any deeper dialogically and relationally than that, so that what is on offer in the biblical text, in the Old Testament text, is a God who is dialogical from the ground up. And that is profoundly subversive of our whole theological tendency to imagine that God is a fixed, settled point, rather than a party to an ongoing dialogical engagement. And so the awareness that we are elementally dialogical creatures in the image of a dialogical God has huge implications for everything about our social practice.
So I'm fascinated by this. I think this is wonderful stuff, but I'm thinking that dialogical conversation doesn't have to be conversation. It can be presence, and not. Does that make any sense to you? So that sometimes we don't have the words, but just our capacity to be in the breach or something. Do you have any thoughts about that, Walter?
Well, I think that's right. And when you study the Old Testament, what you got are words. So
Right.
you get to play with and probe the words. But I have no doubt that it can be a nonverbal engagement as well. Though I do think that there is something terrific about being able to bring it to speech.
Sure.
When stuff is brought to speech, it has a chance to be dealt with. But I do not minimize the importance of the nonverbal or the pre-verbal or whatever. Yes.
Yeah, and I just have, I do a lot of the debriefings with our students who are in CPE, and doing their first unit of, like really being with people who are in pain or their families are in pain. And part of the learning curve of presence is not having to have all the words, but actually to be emotionally present, but not necessarily giving answers and so on. So, I was thinking about that again, building capacities in relationships, in ministry leadership, how important there's like different pieces to all of that. Oftentimes, I was the opposite. I didn't have words, but a lot of people have quick answers too, in the face of, like the Job's friends, right? So they come to him and
yes, right.
Got all kinds of answers, and that's one of the ways that we do what I suppose deny the humanity, deny the pain and stuff, is to try to have.
Well, Job's friends did sit silently with him for many days. They get credit for that.
Thank you for reminding me. That's partly I get cranky about them, so that's helpful. Thank you.
Well, yeah, they're not too winsome.
Right, that's right. They're not winsome.
Right.
Do you see that there was a trajectory in the development of your awareness in the Old Testament? Like, what is there any difference? Were you a Jeremiah aficionado right from the beginning of your of your studies, or did you see that change over time for you in terms of either your scholarship or your interest in the Old Testament?
Well, I think I did, because when I went to graduate school, I was simply shocked that I had to do all that historical critical study that didn't really interest me. But I spent a long time, as much as I could, mastering the critical apparatus, and it took me a good while to move beyond that and to discover that my proper venue for my work was the church and not the academy. And that was a sort of a wrenching discovery for me. I think what moved me along about that, I had lots of opportunities in local churches, and then I sort of signed on with several trajectories of liberation hermeneutic concerning race and gender. And then midpoint, I spent about 10 years in therapy, working on my own unresolved stuff, family sort. And all of that made a huge difference in how I read texts and understood them. So I think it was growing into my own authority with the text, so that I didn't have to footnote everything and appeal to someone else's authority. But I don't think that process can be rushed, and certainly wasn't rushed in my case.
I was thinking back to the wise advisor I had in my doctoral studies who said, this is the time when you speak for your own thoughts. You don't try to pull together everybody else's. So I think that I think that's bad political advice. Okay.
To get your degree.
Oh, I see.
You gotta, because I always tell my students, getting a degree is not an academic process; it's a political process.
Well, that's
and
real.
So you got to touch all the bases to get the votes for approval. So that's a little more cynical than I need to be, but you know.
No, that's really true.
My own sense is, in my case, it was wise to wait till after I got my degree to use my voice very much. But I'm glad you had that good advisor.
There's some out there. I was just remembering hearing Gerda Lerner talk about what happened after, in her case, she got tenure, but the thing she was interested in shifted dramatically after she had the freedom to be able to do what from her own voice. So
exactly.
But I think about that relative, because a part of what Bowen theory talks about is being able to be, Ed Friedman said, more and more in your own skin, and you're talking about the various parts of your life contributing to being more and more into your own authority, your own skin about this intriguing vocation that you had in the church. And also the whole thing, I think this is true of most people who teach, is what's the grounding principle? Is it about my discipline, or is there something I'm serving, which, those of us who are in theology and other ministry preparation, the church is very much a part of who we're serving. So being able to be clear about that identity, I think, is really important.
Yes, and I think that the younger people who go into academic work, this is really very difficult, because the acquiring of tenure now is very problematic, and you got to publish academic stuff, and so the preoccupation with the expectations of the discipline are greater and greater than they used to be, and I think it's very difficult for young scholars not to commit completely to that, but to pay attention to the church and what it expects and what it requires.
So, I mean, the corollary, I think, with people who are involved in ministry leadership would be being overly attentive to what other people want rather than.
That's right, and what the ecclesiastical force wants. I think a lot of pastors are compelled by the number of members and the number of dollars and the number and to have some freedom in the face of that, I think is not very easy.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question that goes back a little bit, Walter, and I think it's an interesting one, going back to your references to Jeremiah. And so one of our participants has asked for your thoughts about the pain that you feel is or you think is unacknowledged in our society today that would correlate with what Jeremiah talks about.
Well, I think the big crisis in the book of Jeremiah was the cluster of institutions around Jerusalem that were failing. The king failed, the temple failed, everything they count on failed, and they continued to cling to it and would not relinquish it. Mm-hmm. Now, mutatis mutandis, I think that is an exact description of our society that was reflected in the GOP fantasy show last night, the debate, in which what we are witnessing is that we now live in a failed economy. We live in a failed U.S. exceptionalism. We live in failed schools. We live in churches that may not survive. All of those institutional structures and support cause people to feel displaced and left out and left behind and alienated. And our politicians do not help us because they keep promising that they're going to restore it all, which of course they're not. None of them is going to restore any of that. So we require ourselves increasingly to live in an illusionary world of the way we thought it used to be, that it isn't going to be, and in fact never was. Mm-hmm. And when we live with such illusions, we are fated to incredible disappointments. And they are disappointments that we don't want to face up to and that we cannot talk about. And so we produce hurt selves that then want to blame somebody or get angry at someone or attack someone. But in fact, none of that relieves any of the disappointment. That's what I think is the situation in which we are, and what people pay many ministers to do is to engage in that pretense along with them, so you cannot talk honestly about how it is with us and how it is going to be with us. And I think that we live in a shared illusion, even while we have this sinking awareness that it is an illusion. We are mostly not very open to entertaining any alternative to that. I think that is exactly the circumstance of Jeremiah. So in the book of Jeremiah, the prophet Hananiah, who is labeled a false prophet, he represents the maintenance of the illusion. And what he announces after the first deportation to Babylon, he just says, well, we'll all be back to normal in 2 years. We're just going to have 2 years of trouble, and then it'll all be fine. And of course, that was the official liturgic claims of the city of Jerusalem, and Jeremiah had to live in the midst of that. So our capacity for illusion is immense, and I think that's how Jeremiah found it in his time.
Well, and then I think about going on, and this was a connection with the participants' question too. Then, what becomes who in this day and age does the acknowledging of the pain? And I think that Bowen theory would say that we work at it in whatever environment we find ourselves in, to be the most honest and direct, and to fight at the illusions, going towards reality. But when you see, as you said, the institutions that are failing, and frankly, across the board, there are shared illusions. It wasn't just what you call what was it, the fantasy debates or something that you
Yes, right,
but
right.
I'd say the State of the Union was a bit of that too, which I watched. It's just
Yes,
a different version.
that's right. He has to say those things in that venue. That's right. So I do think we all have to work as we are able, but it does seem to me that the pastor is peculiarly positioned to break open that world of illusion, even though very, very many church people do not want pastors to do that. I think my sense is that people come to church with huge ambivalence. On the one hand, they really do want the truth to be told, and on the other hand, they are scared to death that the truth is going to be told. And I think that the pastor has got to weave her way through that ambivalence.
A lot of weaving.
Yes, yeah.
And and we talk in family systems about the connection with the larger societal emotional process too. So all this going on adds to the ambivalence in the pew or in the seminary too, where we have students, faculty dealing. Okay, everything. The church in its current form is in process of changing. I always say that we're in another Reformation. Then what do you cling to? You cling to God.
That's right.
And know that there's something on the other side that you may not see too.
Yeah. But even when we say cling to God, then it matters a great deal that the God to whom we cling is not a fixed point, but is a dialogical partner. And there is a temptation among us, I think, to say when we cling to God when everything else fails, that we really want to imagine that God then is a fixed, unchanging point, and that God in the biblical tradition, for the most part, is not on offer, I think, which makes it even more difficult.
So can I just make a reference to Job and see what you think? I'll go back to you rightfully shared the larger view of his friends, but it seems to me that Job was very much in a dialogical relationship with God, and that it included anger and not denial or to curse him, but that there was this back and forth. Do you have any thoughts about that, or would you disagree with me about that?
No, I do indeed. And I want to mention a piece of bibliography that your listeners may be interested in. Sam Ballantyne is the best Job interpreter of our generation, and he has written a wondrous commentary. And he has called my attention to a place in Jeremiah 40 in the speeches of God, which I had missed. It's a description. It's either the hippopotamus or the crocodile, in which God describes this animal that is so majestic and wonderful and fierce and ferocious. But at the beginning of that, God says to Job, I have created this creature like you, so that God is inviting Job to be free and ferocious and fierce and strong. And that leads to the judgment at the end of Job's speech in chapter 42, to the argument that Job's final response to God has been mistranslated among us, where Job traditionally says, I repent in dust and ashes, and gives in. And it is entirely possible to translate Job's last response by saying to God, well, okay, but I'm still right. So that the dialogue is not closed, but that Job has the fierceness to continue to stand in God's face and hold up his end of the dialogue. So the rereading of the last chapters about the engagement of God and Job, which Ballantyne lines out so well, really is very valuable for the pastoral enterprise, because I think our traditional reading is that finally God overwhelms Job and silences him, and this reading suggests that God really wants a better dialogue partner than that.
So it's interesting to me, and I've been intrigued both by Jeremiah and Job since I've been doing this family systems work, Walter. And one of the things that I found really helpful is the parallel when we do our family work, which is one of the major grounding things with Bowen theory, and that is by moving in a way of moving towards parents, grandparents, whatever it is that extended family where there's been blocks or blame or whatever, and that one does get energy, as you're saying, when you face that kind of relational pain too. But then when we have the capacity to stand and direct things towards those incarnational relationships, that the blame goes away and family become resources, not something that we need to protect against. So it just opens things up, and the restoration is not more stuff, but it's possibility, it's more connection and so on. So I found Job to be particularly, for me, very intriguing way to kind of look at that. And also I think that Job shook a fist at God, which is absolutely part of the human condition too, is to say, this stinks, but I'm not going to let go. God doesn't.
That's right. And as you know, at the end of 42, God says twice that Job has spoken what is right. Yeah. So that God concedes that Job was a faithful dialogical partner to God. Yeah.
We have a couple of thoughts from our community here. One participant said, I'm reminded of the General's line, that would be Jack Nicholson's part in A Few Good Men, where he said, you can't handle the truth. I don't know if you remember that movie.
Yes, I do. I do.
Is our fear rooted in our questioning whether we have the ability to respond creatively to a new reality? That's the question. How can it be both honest? How can we be both honest about the way things are, and how can we be honest about our ability to respond to it?
Well, I think that's right. I think we don't know, we can never know ahead of time whether we have the ability to respond, but stepping outside of the illusion immediately puts us into free fall. Mm-hmm. And I think we all have a dread of free fall. Sure. And what we regularly discover when we step out of the illusion is that the free fall is not as scary as we had anticipated it being, but we can never know that ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
And even if we have previously experienced that in a way that worked for us, we still don't know about that the next time. So that we are always, it seems to me, in process of deciding whether we have the energy and the courage to break open yet another illusion for the sake of new possibility. I suppose that the pastoral task is to be present while we are endlessly making that decision about trying to take that step.
And I think about holding ourselves accountable to take the step ourselves, because you can't expect others to do that which we. This is what I consider to be one of the great gifts and scary things about being in ministry, is you can't ask others to tithe if you're not doing. I mean, just example. So to be brave enough to move into the free fall.
That's right. Yeah. My observation, however, is that the temptation of church members, when pastors do that in a sort of a visible way, very many church members do not say, "Oh, I see how that works." They rather want to gather around the pastor and reassure the pastor, "It's okay, it's okay, but we don't intend to go there, but it's okay for you to do that." So, it's a very tricky kind of process to bear witness to that personally, and then to invite people to notice that that's a way to live.
Right. I think it's a huge dilemma in this day and age for ministry leaders. And again, the family systems approach would say you work on yourself first. But I found that narrating myself when I was a parish pastor was always helpful. Is telling people how what I was doing was connecting with my struggle with what I believed. And that helped sometimes, not all the time.
Yes, of course. Right, right.
With some people, others, would be angry or trying to be, sort of, in some ways patronizing, or, oh, you're young, you don't understand, you're
that's
too
right.
much into being.
That's exactly right.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
One of our participants also said, in reflection to how what you were talking about Job, I think, God is not afraid of a full-sized human. That was the quote.
That's exactly it. And I think that the way I've been helped to read Job 40 about that is that that's exactly the case. And that is against the traditional reading of the whirlwind speeches. We traditionally read it as though Job wants to crush anyone who might challenge God. I mean, God wants to crush anyone who might challenge God. But in fact, it is a welcome to have a partner who is willing to continue the conversation at a more ferocious level.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah. I actually wrote that quote down here for me to do some more thinking about. Another participant just is making an observation that if we don't realize we're living in an illusion, then we are again afraid to go into the unknown future too. So I think this is a restating what you said earlier, Walter, that one has to know that there's an illusion in order to break that open.
That's right. And the ideological forces that sustain the illusion among us are so powerful that to suggest that there there is life outside the illusion is a huge, hard piece of work. Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned the pharmaceutical industry. I'm just astonished on TV about the sequence of ads for drugs in which you can get everything taken care of. And I said to my wife the other night as we were watching something, it's amazing that on all these drug ads, people get to pet horses and ride fast boats, but no one ever has to work. It's wonderful. And I'm still looking for that drug.
To take away all worry and all work.
That's right. Right.
And it's interesting too who's targeted in what channels. My spouse is an avid golfer, and on the Golf Channel, they're geared towards men's biggest fears. So, and then occasionally I'm home and can watch TV in the morning, and all those talk shows are geared towards women's greatest fears. How to be, not age, not have any kind of physical problems. And when they list all the side effects of all the drugs too.
Yes, right. It's worse than the initial problem.
That's right. That's right.
Yep.
One of our participants is quoting here one of the family systems leaders in the country, and he writes, Dr. Michael Kerr indicated that dealing with the world as it is, rather than as what we wish it to be, is a marker of systems thinking, vis-a-vis moving towards a more factual understanding. And then he goes on to say, this shift in thinking about the human condition can allow humans to be different with their families and with others.
Well, I have no doubt that's right about the systems approach, but I would say it's also what faith is about.
Yeah.
Faith is about dealing with the real world apart from illusion, and I'm glad that foundational claims of faith and the practice of the systems approach are agreed about that. Indeed.
And it's interesting, and maybe you have some thoughts about this, Walter, but clergy are very attracted to systems thinking, and it appears to be one of the parts of the growth of the sharing of that thinking and learning about it that's strongest among clergy. And I think that may have to do with for one thing, we're constantly with families, and and also thinking in terms of faith. So how to be both kind of grounded in what you believe, and then also realistic about what human beings are like too. So
I think that's right. But let me comment this way and see if this makes sense. If we say faith-wise out of the Old Testament that reality is elementally relational, that means that God, neighbor, self, if you do it that way, are all relative to each other, and while God has some priority, God is not a fixed point. What that would suggest to me that before Murray Bowen, the Old Testament already had a sense of a systems understanding of the important realities of life, in which God, self, and neighbor only can be who they can be in relationship to the other two members of the triangle. And I think that the betrayals of faith in the Bible, in the tradition, are always an attempt to dissolve that triangular system of God, self, and neighbor by making God too big at the cost of self, or by eliminating the neighbor, or by making self too big at the cost, so that what happens is that triangular relationship gets skewed in many directions, and it is exceedingly difficult to sustain and maintain it in a practice of fidelity. So I don't want to take anything away from systems theory, but I want to insist that it didn't come out of the blue, but the elements, the components of that were already available in this faith tradition, and therefore I think it's not at all accidental that the great tradition of psychosocial healing all is Jewish based, with Freud and so on. That tradition has understood from the beginning that these cunning and demanding relationships are really what constitute reality. Mm-hmm. And you cannot escape them, but you can only work at them.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting because I think that Bowen would say, not that I ever met him and not that I can channel him, but I think he would say he was just describing reality.
Yep.
And
yep.
that in some ways parts of our culture had lost connection with that, which the Hebrews understood, that organic relational part of life that we somehow became separated from. But
that's right. Yep.
The whole idea of a three-part system is very much embedded in our faith. God's got three parts.
That's right.
And how we understand the Trinity is, and I know that within different traditions we lift up one part of the Trinity more than others, but I think what you're saying is very interesting about the attempts to dissolve one part of the triangle. It is something that dissolves humanity as well. The God, self, the neighbor. And to keep them all in relation to each other as part of the faith journey too. I think that's very interesting way to put that too.
Yeah, good.
And when we move to a two-part system, it's not very stable, is what the systems theory would say too. Is that the idea is to keep all of the three connected. So a lot of times I hear from students that they want to get out of triangles. That they've been taught to get out of triangles, and it's just part of a full relational possibility. Is that those three parts? Yeah.
Well, I want to say that I'm grateful for this piece of the conversation, because I had not thought until this minute of that parallel, I suppose, that I think for me illuminates a great deal of the work of the text.
Yeah, great. That's great. There is another question that has to do with our political life. I'm going to postpone that until for a few more minutes, because I want to get to a couple more questions that I have. But Jim, I want you to know I'm not going to forget your question here that's on the chat box. But if you were to think, Walter, about the resources that your family or your experience, either the family that grew you up or the family you've created in adulthood, what would you say have been the most compelling, deepening resources that your family has given to you?
Well, I suppose first I'd have to say a work ethic.
Oh, that'll do.
That's what I do, is I work.
Yes, I got that one too.
Did you say something?
Yeah, I did, but please go ahead.
I think that my family has given me a solid sense of self and a solid moral location, and a conviction about the church community that at its best matters definitively to me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have to say that my family of origin also had significant parochial markings, and part of my ongoing work is to grow out of that, which I have by no means finished. But I think that the gifts of a reliable footing in that pietistic tradition far outweigh the parochialisms that have limited it, and so I think that's my ongoing work and the ongoing gift. So it's both gift and task. Because I am able to see, as I get older and older and older, that the trajectories of this kind of healthiness were present in my family in ways that I think the members of my family didn't even recognize.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think I have been required to contradict any of that along the way.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how I would put the main resource that I got there.
And I think that's one of the thoughts about the family work for folks in ministry and in other places too, is that we begin to get outside the blame or the idea of a victim of whatever, and see that our families have done the best that they could with the resources they have, and that there's always resources we're given forward. And then it's up to us to take responsibility too for growing ourselves up at a certain stage as well.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I think that squares with my experience of that. That whatever those parochialisms have been, they no longer are legitimate causes of my not living well and freely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I had a long talk when I got married. I've been married 25 years, and when I got married, I made a decision to maintain my birth name, and it was just really clear. My spouse and I are fine about it. We talked about it and so on. But I went to my father and just said, just to let you know, and he said, absolutely not. And so we had this ongoing conversation over a long time. First, he thought it was illegal. It was the limits of his awareness that this is possible. And then when he and I talked about the facts, eventually, that I was proud that I was an ox, he began to see it differently. But I did have questions about whether or not, that I was disappointing him with, but it didn't change what I did. But we had ongoing conversations that it was an affirmation of him and our family that predated my marriage. So, as you're talking about parochialism and how to just, I know that he's a product of his time and his experience, and and it created lots of good conversation throughout the rest of his life too. So I think about how now it looks funny. At the time, I was really angry, frankly. So, but
right.
Now I can look back
and
go.
He came to a greater appreciation of his own life through no doubt.
I think that's right, Walter. I think that's right. I was able to see that, but it took a little bit of time.
Yes. It always takes a little.
So, I have heard you speak. I've been in a couple of AAPC events where you were one of the speakers. And one of the things that I noticed about you is just that there is this kind of real, honest grounding that's a part of how you are when you present and so on. And even these conversations, and I think I sent you this question, but you obviously can laugh. You've been through a lot. You have done tremendous scholarship. You've been able to produce lots of things and be creative. And what do you think were the major pieces that have contributed for you being the person that you are today? And that, I mean, you talked about the family that you grew up into, but are there other things that you think have allowed you to stay in that triangle every once in a while? Just be able to be more present, and that's really one of the thoughts about systems thinking, is being able to be more present in your skin, available but clear about who you are too. What do you think about that?
Well, as I've gotten older, I've reflected a lot on the conversation partners
Mm.
that I have had over time, and I live a lot in my head. I read a great deal, and some of my most important conversation partners uh, have come out of my reading. So I can remember the day that I finally caught on to what Paul Ricoeur was writing about, and I've spent too much energy trying to understand him. But I got the whole awareness of imagination from him,
Mm.
and I have formulated imagination as the capacity to entertain a world other than the one that is in front of me. And that has been a huge reference point for me, because I think most of us, and certainly I, are preoccupied with the world that is in front of us. But it seems to me that the gospel is always inviting us to another world that is not escapism, but is in fact the real world that is outside the illusionary world that is so much in front of us. So that's a kind of a playful thing in which I've had many conversation partners and many teachers that have contributed to the awareness that the world is not a given, the world is a construct. And if the world is a construct, it can be constructed alternatively.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I wouldn't have any trouble, as much as I understand systems theory, I wouldn't have any trouble translating that to say that the system can be transposed so that it works differently. The world can be imagined differently. That's been a big trajectory that I have been able to piece together over a long period of time.
Yeah, I just was with Peter Marty in Davenport, Iowa, and one of the things that he really stresses a great deal is maintaining imagination, that which you don't yet know, and to be interacting with those whose their own experience and imagination is outside our own bounds. So what you're talking about, even about entering in to the world of other authors and friends or whatever, and being able to kind of process things. We tell our students here when they get ready for their first ministry call, just be open to the place that you don't yet know, because a lot of times they're limited by their past experience and they want something, a replication of something that's happened before. I think systems thinking would say, and folks that are on the conversation, please give some feedback on this, but would say that in fact there's a lot of us that we do that's automatic, that is that shuts down imagination, and that part of increased awareness is opening up that capacity to not necessarily act or be in the same way automatically all the time, so that it gives more options for how we live too.
Yes, and I think that's a big challenge for liturgic leaders about how do you keep reperforming the liturgy so that it's not on automatic pilot, but in fact is an imaginative, every time is an imaginative reperformance. Mm-hmm. That really is a huge piece of work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm going to just ask one more question. I will, and then I'll turn things over to a couple questions that have been accumulating in the chat box. But in family systems, we talk a lot about this dance that people do between being close and being an individual, or separate. And that one of the things that happens when we're in the middle of that, when the relationships are in shift or change, is that we have to struggle with anxiety of some kind. Do you have any thoughts about that relative either to your own scholarship or your own life experience? Do you have any thoughts about that dance between being a separate, clear person and also staying in relationships? And the anxiety that may come when those things change?
Yeah, I don't think that rings true to my experience, but I don't think I have anything new or fresh to say about that. I do know about that in my own life, and I think that my bent when I am intentional is the process of mainly distancing and staking out new territory, which is why I keep writing, because writing is my particular mode of imagination. When I am unintentional, I find myself being drawn back to safer modes of connectedness. So I'm sort of aware of the ways in which anxiety surfaces in both directions. Anxiety about evaporating into old patterns, or anxiety about being so far out that I'm not connected.
Right.
And so I write almost every day, and I think about that almost every day, because I've figured out that at the end of my pen, I write everything longhand. I love to see my pen creating new space for my life. But I also think that's a kind of a risky thing for me to be doing. So I work at that with considerable awareness.
It's really interesting about the disciplines that one can have that invite clarity. And I have a colleague who just stopped going to conferences and just decided he was going to concentrate on his own thinking. So he started writing regularly, or figuring out a way to both connect with people and also, figure out what is that you need to do or think or expand in, and so on. So it's an interesting thing, Walter, to talk about your discipline and how that might, how people on the conversation might think about how they seek clarity too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm sure we all have our own ways.
Yeah, and we're doing it more. We have a leadership series that meets on Fridays once a month, and we've been doing more with having people write rather than talk first, so that they get their thoughts out, and just experimenting with that as might be a way to assist people along the way. So a couple of questions from our conversation partners in the chat box. One of our participants said, if God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, I assume you're saying that you are saying that the sameness of God is that God continues to be in dialogue with us, or God is a fixed point to whom we can look to be in dialogue. Which of those two, I think he's asking?
I would say the former. The way I like to think about that is that a parent ought to be the same yesterday and today and forever for the child, but the parent's got to be really different when the child is 3 or 16 or 43. So to stay the same requires one to change. and I think that's a useful way to think about the sameness of God. Uh, God is not the same when we are 3 and when we are 17 and so on. And of course, one of the great problems in the church is that most people quit growing in their understanding of God maybe when they got confirmed when they were 13 or something like that. So we haven't done our work about seeing how sameness is a very dynamic process and not a closed settlement.
And another, just this is a comment that someone made, and if you'd like to reflect on it, Walter. If we don't realize we're living in an illusion, then we're again afraid to go into the unknown future, which leads to the thinking, if we just get the right minister, rather than doing the work during the interim time of looking at congregational dynamics and self. Do you have any thoughts about that? I can repeat.
Well, I would say we're not only afraid to go. I think we are unaware that we could, and we don't have any reason to think that we ought to. If the illusion is compelling to us, as it is for many of us much of the time, there isn't any energy or motivation to think otherwise. So I think it's more problematic simply than fear. Like, why should I do that? This is working, and probably it's the best we can get. So let's just make this work better.
On the contemporary scene, are there any commentators, candidates, or writers exposing the illusion in which we're living? Who might be some of them, at least in part? Do you have any?
Well, I think Jim Wallace at Sojourners comes to mind. I think Miroslav Volf at Yale works at some of this. I think, what's the columnist for the New York Times? Christoph, what's his name? Who keeps writing about third world problems and bearing witness to us about the pain that is out there. So I think there are a number of voices that are telling the truth for us about these matters. Some of them are well grounded in the church, and some of them stand in other critical traditions. But the critical tradition includes many allies who are not church-based, and they're all important to us. So I think it's pretty easy to identify them.
So another comment, and I know you're familiar with all of this, Walter, but the whole idea of differentiation of self, that's part of the Bowen thinking. So this person makes reference to God as a differentiated entity. If we're created in God's image, are we to be differentiated? And is this what we see Job is able to, what person says, assert in chapter 42, God's willingness and wantingness of this differentiation, each entity knowing its value. And I've started, instead of using that technical description of differentiation of self, which is a Bowen description, I'm often using maturity as a way to describe the process of becoming more and more. But in this case, the participant is talking about differentiation. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think so. I think that the biblical word for that differentiation is covenant, in which covenant partners do not merge. They live in a tense, demanding, open, unsettled relationship, and they got to come to terms with each other. so that the words that are used for that in the Old Testament are righteousness, justice, steadfast love, mercy, faithfulness. Those are the big five words, and they are all words that have to do with the problematic of fidelity. And I think that fidelity is indeed the riddle of differentiation and solidarity. And it is a very thorny problem through the Old Testament, and a very helpful way to do that. But that's why there is such a nice interface between the Old Testament and systems theory, because there isn't any other religious tradition, nor Greek philosophy, that imagines that the ultimate player in reality, God, is in fact an engaged character who struggles with relationship. So this articulation of the character of God vis-a-vis other differentiated partners is very peculiar, and I don't think it takes any imagination then to see how this is carried into the New Testament and into the Christian gospel and all of that. So I think that's exactly right, that differentiation and faithful engagement are the nature of the covenant, which is, in the Old Testament, is almost always in crisis.
Amen. And another, I think, this is a question. Do you have any suggestions about how to discern the difference between imagining that which is real and that which is an illusion? That's a tough one.
Well, I think that's difficult and tricky, but I would say the test is what the claim does to our bodies. You can't fool your body. And the fact that we now live in a predatory capitalism that is creating more and more distressed bodies of poor people, for example, is an indication that the system is phony and has failed. So I think what happens to our bodies is the test case about what's real.
Yeah, I think about the ability to listen to the wisdom of our bodies and what happens to them, and what kind of messages that they're giving. That's talk about nonverbal communication too, and at a societal level too. What's happening?
I think that's right, and I think the onslaught of pharmaceutical stuff wants to silence those whispers. Yeah. Your body is not saying anything important, so just silence it.
Let's see here. I think that, are there any other comments or questions? We're getting to the final minutes of our time and conversation here, and just want to ask if there's any closing questions for Walter or for me before we give our thanks and sign off. I think that we've got a couple of wonderful quotes, Walter. I've written them down, and I think a couple of things on the chat box indicate that some of our participants want to think more about your description of covenant and how that relates to differentiation of self. I think that that's giving us lots of food for thought in the world that we live in too. Any other comments, folks? I think that would be it. Walter, do you have any closing thoughts about our conversation today from your end?
No, I'm very glad to have this chance to have this conversation, because it will draw me into greater reflection now about Bowen stuff and the whole systems theory, and I'm very glad to know that that network is out there, and glad to make contact with it.
It's great. I would welcome any continuing conversation with you, Walter, for us and for our learning especially. It's been actually I think, very thoughtful conversation about the resources that we have in Old Testament, in the Old Testament world. And I, in my own teaching for systems, I often use the stories in the Old Testament as examples of a lot of the dynamics. So this is really helping me with my teaching. Thank you for that.
Okay,
Appreciate
thank you.
that very much. Gratitude to just expressing gratitude to you, our participants, for your thoughts and your presence with us. And we will be, folks, we've recorded this conversation that will be available in the next week or so to our member portal on our website. So please feel free to make access to that. And I just want to underscore our next conversations will be held February 12th, which is a Friday again from 10:30 to 12. And Tony Wilgus will be in conversation about some of the work that he's doing on clergy families, and in particular around clergy spouses and his own background in family systems work. So we look forward to that. That's February 12th. I just want to say again, thank you to Dr. Walter Bruggemann for a really enriching conversation this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Blessings. Goodbye to all.